The international airwaves are thick with the prospect of war. Unexplained explosions near the nuclear reactor in Iran, a military, political, economic standoff with China in the Straits of Taiwan in the South China Sea, and perhaps most ominously of all, on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Over the last few weeks, the United States government has repeatedly stated that they believe Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO or of the EU, but you could say that it is semi-detached from both, i.e., not quite there, but also not quite separate. The United Kingdom government reportedly last weekend added its voice to that of the United States in stating that it believed Russia was going to invade Ukraine. Trouble at mill. There's trouble on the horizon, so we better look more closely at it. Who better to interview about it than an expert on the situation from the University of South-Eastern Norway. He's a professor of political economy, Professor Glenn Diesen, and he joins us now. Glenn, thanks very much for doing so. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about war in the Donbass. Is that really possible?
Well, thank you for inviting me. And yes, unfortunately, it is a possibility. It's becoming a growing possibility, and even worse, it has all the potential to grow into a larger conflict, which between Russia and NATO. So this is one of the more dangerous times we've been in for several decades.
And what's the origin of this crisis?
It's a domestic conflict to some extent in Ukraine, but it's also a regional conflict that is in divided Europe. So obviously this conflict began, at least the latter phases began in 2014 when the West backed a coup in Ukraine, toppling Yanukovych, the democratically elected president, and therefore putting Ukraine on the path towards integrating with NATO. Now, this is considered an existential threat to Russia. So for this reason, there's a conflict on two levels. On one hand, in order to cement this Ukraine into NATO, they have to have a represented mostly by Western Ukrainians. So it requires the suppression of the Eastern Ukrainians. So this is a problem for Russia, but it's also the threat of NATO expansion, which threatens Russia. So for this reason, we see now that Russia has drawn its red lines. And on the other side, we hear the United States saying that they will not respect any red lines. So we're effectively in a game of chicken, which can end, very likely in war.
Well, let's look at the worst case scenario. Perhaps using the continued shelling from the Ukrainian military of the breakaway republics in the east of the country. Russia moves in and secures to defend the Russian-speaking people, many of whom are actually dual citizens, and perhaps even as far as the Dnieper River, and effectively, therefore, Ukraine is partitioned. What does NATO do about that?
Well, that's what's uncertain. Now, the United States have recently stated that they would not intervene militarily, which would limit their response to economic and political sanctions. Now, that being said, it's not that easy to predict what would happen in such a major crisis, because this would be a major war. So obviously, NATO would begin then to initiate different mechanisms for deterrence. So they would probably escalate tensions, move missiles around. They have already threatened moving nuclear missiles into Poland. So there's a lot that could be done to escalate tension. The problem is that NATO argues that this is Russian aggression, which means that they have to deter. The problem is the more NATO argues it's deterring, this is seen very differently in Russia because they see this as merely being NATO expansionism. And deterrence means they're moving their military infrastructure further to Russian borders, elevating the threat. Also by offering support for the government in Kyiv, they're also emboldening President Zelensky to take military actions against Donbass if they think they have the Americans behind them. Not that different from Saakashvili in Georgia of 2008.
Wasn't the Minsk agreement supposed to avoid all this?
Yes, so the Minsk agreement seeks a solution between the government in Kyiv and the Donbass region, who does not recognize the legitimacy of the coup that took place in 2014. So the Kyiv agreement states very explicitly the first point should be that Kyiv must establish a diplomacy and a dialogue with Donbass in order to negotiate some autonomy for the region in essentially federalizing Ukraine. Now, this was the first point. This should be done on day one. However, now it's been 6 years later, and the government in Kyiv is very openly saying it's refusing to honor its obligations under the Minsk agreement. Now, you would think, therefore, that if NATO wanted peace, they would pressure Ukraine to do something. But instead, we see over the past 6 years, they've done the opposite. They've been arming Ukraine and putting sanctions on Russia, therefore trying to shift the balance of the region. At the same time, they're now also undermining the Minsk agreement rhetorically by suggesting that it's Russia that's not honoring the Minsk agreement.
Why didn't the EU and NATO, just as I mentioned earlier about semi-detached, why didn't they effectively allow Ukraine to join the EU and join NATO?
Well, they are hardly ready to join either. But a key problem has also always been that Ukraine never really previously didn't want to join NATO. I mean, when NATO offered future membership to Ukraine in 2008, there was only about 20% of the population who wanted to join NATO. And what we've seen after the coup of 2014, in which the democratic president was toppled, we've seen that the main opposition leader has been arrested. There's been a crackdown on media, the political opposition. You had this anti-terrorist operation against the people of Donbass who reject their legitimacy. So there's been this focus on marginalizing the people who opposed this joining NATO. But obviously, if Ukraine would join NATO today, that would then trigger, then they could use Article 5 to trigger a collective response against Russia. So at that point, we would actually have what would be a world war, or at least a nuclear war between NATO and Russia. So far, countries like France and Germany especially has been very hesitant to accept Ukraine into NATO, but the Americans have been pushing very hard that they want Ukraine in NATO, thinking that if they only bring Ukraine in, then Russia wouldn't dare to say anything, and this would effectively become a sphere of exclusive influence for the Americans.
Well, were all these problems inevitable upon the breakup of the Soviet Union? Is that, in a way, the starting point of all this?
Yes, well, that was the original sin. I mean, from 1975, from the Helsinki Accords, we were moving towards looking for some format for pan-European security architecture. Now, what happened when, and this again contributed to the end of the Cold War in 1989, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 91, we began to abandon the idea of a common Europe. Instead, we began to construct a Europe without Russia. Now, we call this European integration, but it becomes a bit of a paradox because we're not removing dividing lines, we're just moving them further and further to the east. So this has been kind of the original sin, our inability to create a common security architecture, because instead we have this very zero-sum European structure where we simply move lines closer and closer to Russia. And this becomes an existential threat to Russia, in which it has to become less reliant on European economies. It has to put down red lines, be more willing to take greater risks with military force in order to stop further NATO expansion. So obviously, in the 1990s, if we would have had a common security architecture recognizing Russia also has legitimate security interests, then we wouldn't have come to this point.
To some extent, I see this as a false dichotomy. Obviously, the existence of the Soviet Union was an existential challenge to the political and economic system in Western countries. But now that the Soviet Union is 30 years dead, 40 years dead nearly, certainly 30, and Russia is a capitalist country, what's the reason for this dichotomy?
Well, I guess during the Cold War, it was more comfortable because there were natural dividing lines. You had, capitalism, communism, democracy, a totalitarian system. You had, Christianity versus atheism. I think after the Cold War, there's been even more need to recast a new division and create new dividing lines in order to justify why Russia can't be a part of Europe. Because once, as the US ambassador to NATO explained in the 90s, if Russia's allowed to be part of the European security architecture, that effectively means there would be less of a role for the United States. So we never, after the Cold War, were able to find a format for durable peace because we didn't want to reform the Cold War architecture too much.
Isn't it true that they just don't like President Putin because he's made Russia strong again?
Well, that was the problem. That was the whole opportunity for, in the West in the 90s, is we didn't have to take Russia into consideration because they were seen as being weak and essentially the worst deal we gave the Russians would still be the only deal on the table. The problem is after Putin took power, I can criticize him in many ways, but he was also able to strengthen Russia. He brought, the energy resources back into the country and thus preventing some quasi-colonial status. And he was able to strengthen Russia. And again, people often criticize Putin, but one has to keep in mind that at the end of the 90s, people assumed that, or many expected that Russia would collapse. Now we have Russia as one of the major players. So obviously he's done something right. Poverty has fallen dramatically under his leadership. So we never constructed a Europe where Russia should have a role. And now that Russia is strong again, we don't recognize any legitimate security interests of Russia, there's simply no place for Russia in Europe. And this is, the source of our problem.
Professor, thanks for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Thank you.